how's everyone feeling? Good? Everyone have a good night last night? Good. Let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about it. Yeah. Okay, so my presentation is things that I should have documented. Being a developer, I like writing code. I don't like documenting things. So I thought this would be an opportunity to explain some of the mistakes I see people making and how I originally envisioned some of these features working. When I wrote the original list, I had about a list of 15 different topics I wanted to talk about. I've done 3. So that's going to give me enough talks for the next few years, at least, to keep coming back and doing more presentations. Okay, so I say these are problems from the wild. There's a bit of things I've been seeing people actually doing themselves, the mistakes they've been making. That photo there is of some crazy high-level walk in a forest somewhere. I found on the internet when I typed in wild, and I thought, oh, I'd like to go there. So I put on there. So this isn't fake news or alternative fact. We live in the era of fake news and alternative facts, but this actually, I have seen people doing these things. So it's hopefully something you will be used to. So inferred types, who uses or knows of inferred types? Okay, it's about a quarter to a third of you. Okay. So, it's already gone too far. Okay, so inferred types. The idea with inferred types when we created it was that you could vary the return type from class based on the template that you are looking at that point in time. So I might have an event. I might have then an offline event and an online event, and I have 2 different templates for that. So I might have a base event class, and then I have some subtypes to represent the 2 other events online. And when I come to my processing, I say to class, I want an event. It returns you then one of the more specific ones if it's relevant. That was the basic idea. And at that point also, it only checks the items template, not the base template types. Now, I have seen some implementations where they've gone into base template type resolving, and that adds a whole level of complexity. If you want to come talk to me about how you do that in a sensible manner, I will say not really in a sensible manner, but yeah. So in my event, I would have a setup of classes like this. You can see there, each one's defined with its template. The online events obviously inherit the event. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple, pretty self-contained classes. That means I can write code like this. I can ask for an event from class. I can tell it to infer the type. And then I can say, well, what did I get an online event? Which is kind of useful if you're iterating through large lists of events, and maybe like on a search page or something like that, you want to render the online events differently to the physical events. So you can highlight them. And it stops you having to just use flags all over the place as properties. So it kind of makes your logic a bit nicer, a bit easier to read, hopefully. And so what we're basically saying is, I want a piece of fruit, and just tell me which piece of fruit I have. So that was the simple, very nice, very self-contained. This is where it kind of went wrong, the curse of glass-based. Who's got a glass-based class? Yeah, all of you. Right. So first off, we often see something like this. This is actually quite a small one. I have seen big ones. Like, we're talking 20, 30 properties on the base class. Why is this a problem? Well, Glass is a mapping framework. So if you are pulling data off an item and onto a model, we have to do the work. Typical things like URL and full path, these ones here, these are really expensive operations. And you sometimes get people saying, well, my implementation's slow. And you go, well, why have you got the URL on every item? You use it in 3 locations. Or full path. I've seen people put full path on there, never use it. Some people don't even know why it's there. They never even realize it's been added. Yeah, so it becomes a bit messy. And then what we have is everything inherits from it. Everything. So can you see where this is going to go? If everything inherits from it and everything's got a template ID, Yeah, so we've talked about that one. What we end up with is this inferring type issue, where everyone goes, give me a glass base and infer something. Now, as a developer, we end up in this situation. It's a something, but what is it? I have no idea at this point in my code. No. But getting anything back? No. And the important thing here is we're basically asking for something, but none of the other things really fit with anything. Or basically what the class-based class ends up being is basically the object class in like standard .NET. And how many people would accept an API that says, give me an object? No. You wouldn't have that normally as a return type from a method of some sort. So when it comes to actually using this, we can also see that the glass base really doesn't tell me anything as well as a developer. So as I come to this code base, and imagine, here it's pretty easy. We've got 4 lines. But if you've got a method that has maybe 20, 30 lines, how do I know what glass-based class you actually want back? We can see here now I want a metadata item. But if that was 30 lines down below the page fold, I'd have to start reading through all that code to try and work out what I want. And we get planes back, we get cats back, and we get bananas back. And in this scenario, if only the plane actually implements the metadata template properly, then if I get a cat and a banana back, I've done work. Because Glass still has to create that object, still has to map that object. But then I just do nothing, I just throw it away. So then you're just doing extra work for no good purpose. Another problem we often see as well with the glass-based problem is that you can have 2 classes that have the same template ID. So any guesses what happens when you try and infer from this scenario?
First one wins.
Yes, basically, first one wins. And the problem with the first one wins is that we load things basically dynamically at runtime by doing, depending on what you're doing, but mostly through assembly scanning. And that assembly scan order can actually change depending, actually I haven't worked out on what, but it does change. I'm not sure if it's by date or something like that. So that means that you can actually have intermittent behavior, which is really difficult to track down. Because on one recycle, it will work, and you think, oh, great, wow, it's working. Next recycle, suddenly it breaks. But you don't know why, because last time it worked. So you attach the debugger, probably recycle it again, and suddenly it's working again. What the, So I tend to call this type hijacking, because your type has been hijacked at runtime. You've asked for one thing, and then somebody else has come in and sideswiped you. And we see this especially on very large developments with lots of different teams. Team A over here is happily working in their little sandbox. They create their models. They ship it, all works. Then Team B goes, oh, I'd like to use the same template ID. I don't know what Team A is doing. I'm not even going to bother looking at what Team A is doing. I'm just going to go ahead and create my models. And later on, only when it gets to production sometimes, because they're not testing each other's stuff works together, it all then blows up once we hit production. Yeah, so we want to try and avoid these scenarios, especially with the glass base. So how do we do that? Well, some of this we can solve with template enforcing. How many people use template enforcing? Even fewer. Good. I think it was literally 6 people. So hopefully we'll change people to minds on this today with education. So the idea with template enforcing is that when we ask for an item from Glass, we verify that the item you asked for implements the template defined on the model. So this means that if you have an item that doesn't implement the event class, well, it doesn't have the same template ID as the event class, it won't return you a model, it will just return you null. So in this way, you can say, only give me data back if it is actually an event. Otherwise, return null and carry on execution. This is good because unlike where we saw with the inferred type thing problem, like with glass base, we see this a lot with glass base, and you will say, I want a glass base, is it an event? With this solution, because we're not inferring the type, we can stop doing the work. So it speeds up execution as well. It also simplifies the business logic. You don't have big if is all the way down. And this does work with base templates because this is simple to apply. So, you know, we're obviously not the first ones to do something like this. Probably everyone has done something like this at some time, but I took this out of the Habitat solution. This is an example of how you might do the same sort of thing if you were using the SUGCON API. For those of you who are heavy glass users, this is the SUGCON API. I know some of you may become a bit disconnected from it. I have over time. But we can see there, you know, that sort of third line down is the item derived from the page metadata. And then we go ahead and we loop through trying to get keywords. And then we're going off over here to get some more items, to do some more modeling. So there's a lot of data mapping going on there. Quite a lot of code, boilerplate code really, to write up. So with template enforcement in Glass, all we have to do is on our model, we have to just add the template ID we want to use. We tell it to enforce it on either the template or the template and base items. And then we've gone from this another line to code to this. So those three plus our model is doing the same as all of that. But for me, it's a bit easier to read. Right? And if this isn't a metadata keyword model, then it will return null. And we can just simply null check it. So also within the inferred type solution, we then can take inferred type off. We can get rid of our glass base. So we can reduce that curse slowly but surely, one class at a time. And we can just do a null check. So this, again, is much safer. You're not going to get somebody accidentally hijacking you halfway through your execution with this solution. OK. We'll bang through this actually quite quickly. OK. Who's used multiple glass contexts? OK. I'm not counting the two guys I'm working with now because I kind of forced them to do it. So that was about 4 people minus them. OK. How many people know you can have multiple contexts in Glass? 2. I've done well. Obviously, the documentation has been really good if 2 people knew that. All right. The context is basically, you know, it's like the brains of Glass. It's where we put all the config for the execution of that instance. So that's where all our pipeline definitions are. That's where all our mappings are. We have our own internal DI resolver. We put that in because everyone complained about Castle Windsor. So we went with our own solution. So yeah, so it's a bit like like a regular IOC container would be for your normal web application, but we can have multiple of them. Creating a context is really, really simple. You just need to tell it, give it a dependency resolver, and give it a name. And then you can start loading your mappings into it. And those contexts will be kept separate at runtime. So this gives us lots of flexibility, which we'll go into in a minute. Once you've created your context, you're obviously going to want to use it. And again, it's the second parameter on the site call service. You can also define it in the config as well. You can say, I want one of my sites running on one context, and I want another site running on another context. If you're brave, what that could mean is you could be using the same models, and if you're using Fluent configuration, you could have one set of mappings for one site on that model, and then fluently configure that differently on another site. Could be useful for task like migration, like you want to just migrate data over. So at some point you want to maybe use a feature toggle to switch from using one set of models to another set of models, that sort of thing. So why? Well, as talked about there, we can have different contexts by site. By separating the context apart, we can do things like control how inferred types work. So I talked about different teams hijacking you. Well, if I come to here, if I do it by team, if each team has got their own context with their own mapping definitions, their own configuration in there, their own data mappers, there's no way that the A team is going to then muck up the fellowship of the ring. So they will keep themselves, and they can play in their own sandpit quite safely, and they don't have to start talking to each other. Generally, I like devs trying to talk to each other, but sometimes it's better just to say, just keep your guys apart. If you're following the Helix principle, we might say, oh, well, why don't we have a different context for each module in our solution? Because there's no limit to how many of these you can spin up at that point. And they're all pretty lightweight. Like, having one is pretty much the same as having 20 in terms of actual resource usage. The memory footprint's pretty small. So with our context isolation, yeah, we can keep our types separated. We can keep our type inferring hierarchies separated, so nobody else can hijack them. If I want to do something crazy in my pipeline, I can do that without upsetting the other developers in other teams. And I think the main one is just the reduced interference from other developers. You're not going to have them calling on you. The other nice thing about the context isolation is also that they all can be working in the same request. So in this scenario, I've got multiple components, and I could have 2 components that are rendered from context A and 2 components rendered from context B. You don't have to think my whole page request needs to be in one context or another context. You can mix and match them as you need to, which is very useful when you're working with lots of different teams delivering different components on the same page. Again, they don't have to coordinate, but we can all still be rendering to the same location. So it's very much as I say, a pick and mix solution with the different contexts. Okay, actually, I went through that quicker than I thought I was. So unfortunately, these are the things I didn't have time to talk about, although it now turns out I maybe did have time to talk about them. These are some other good features, like on-demand and auto-mapping. I could probably give you a brief description. How many people know the difference or have heard of on-demand mapping? We got a couple of nods. Okay, so on-demand mapping is this idea of you don't actually have to tell Glass when Glass starts up how to map your models. What you can do is just at runtime, if you send in a class into Glass and it doesn't know about it, at that point in time, it will go, oh, I'll try and map you. And if you've got attributes on that class, Glass will look at those attributes and load it up. If you don't have any attributes on the class, we do what we call auto mapping, which is where we just look at your properties, and then we follow a convention-based system of going, if the property is called ID, it's probably the ID of the item. If it's name, it's probably the item name. And if it's none of these, we're just going to say it's a field. Everything ends up being a field if it doesn't match any of the other rules. Properties can be protected and private. How many people make use of that tool? How many people knew they could make properties protected and private? Good. So yeah, so there's a confused note. So Glass will inject data into protected and private properties if you mark it up to do so. So this can be quite useful if you actually want to create a model that doesn't expose everything. Because at the moment, especially if you're using CodeGen, you tend to put every property on the model, and you just throw it out to your developers and go, here's everything. And they go, what should I use? And you go, anything, who knows? So protected and private methods, properties can be quite useful, especially in scenarios where, say you've got a title, and you want that title to fall back to maybe the item name if the title's missing. Well, what I can do is I can make the name property and the title private, and then have one public method that does my business logic going, if there's no title, then use the name. But I can encapsulate that then into the model, and I don't have to put that logic into the rendering or into the controller. So then it's a one place then, because if you did that logic in a controller, you're probably either going to duplicate that logic in multiple locations, or you're going to end up with the static util class that everyone ends up with, that everyone calls to, and it's a pain. We have debugging and profiling tools now added. These tools can be very useful if you're trying to diagnose potentially a performance problem. Quite often what we find with performance problems is generally people are trying to get Glass to do too much. So they have very large object graphs and they've maybe turned off lazy loading. And suddenly they ask for one item, like the home node, and suddenly half the databases come back because lazy loading was turned off and they've just gone down all the way. So if you turn on debugging and profiling, it will tell you things like how long did it take to map the model to actually do the construction? How many models were constructed per that request? And you can actually wrap bits of your code and say, well, how much in this bit of code how many models did I create in this bit of code itself? So you can get some really useful sort of diagnostic information coming out of there. And it's just one parameter you need to turn on, and you'll start to get stuff coming out in your logs. I won't do the data matter attribute because I have to, it's really a demo kind of thing to work out about that. Fluent delegate mapping. Who uses Fluent configuration? 2, 3, 4. Yes. Who understands Fluent configuration? Cool. Okay. So for those who are not using it, well, I suppose the other one, how many people use attribute configuration with Glass? Okay. How many just let TDS do it and not worry about it? Yeah, quite a few there. So the idea with Fluent configuration is what we're trying to do here is separate the configuration of our models from the actual classes themselves. So with attribute configuration, you actually have to have access to the source code is one thing, because you have to actually apply the attributes to the model. But also, because it's done at compile time rather than at runtime, there is a little less flexibility in what you can achieve with your configuration. One of the things has to be that all the settings have to become as constants. So you're limited to using strings in the attributes and Boolean values. If you wanted to do anything more cleverer than that, you can't really do it with attributes. So with Fluent configuration, actually this gets processed at runtime. So that means you can now do if logic. Like if I'm on my dev environment, I want my model to be configured this way. But if I'm on production, I want to do it another way. It becomes a lot more flexible. And one of the great things about that is that we can also give you a lot more flexibility in how you can create data mappers. So how many people have created a data mapper? Cool. How many people are happy with the concept of when I say data mapper? Because I know I'm using terms that are sort of just. So there was not many hands, not many shakes of the head that when I asked that question. So I'm just going to explain quickly. A data mapper is simply how we transform the raw site-call string into a known .NET type of some sort. So we take a string value that maybe represents an integer and we turn it into a number. Same with date. Same with links, those sorts of things. So what you can do with Fluent, though, is you can create data mapping very, very quickly by just using Lambda. So you don't have to go through the whole thing of creating a proper data mapper, registering it with the resolver, all that sort of stuff. If you've got a one-off property that you want to actually do just some custom mapping on, maybe for an experiment, maybe for a short-term POCO kind of solution, then the Fluent delegate mapping, you can write it in like 2 or 3 lines. And Nathaniel's got a really good blog post on how to do that, because it was his idea. So I made him do some documentation for that. But it means you can write data mappers really, really quickly. Customizing the Glass HTML helpers, we had that question come up actually yesterday. We now have a factory inside Glass that generates that class. So you can override that. And that means now that you can extend Glass and put your own custom HTML helpers in there. So if you don't like how we're rendering a link, you can start to customize that. I will admit there's probably some more work we can do in that area. So if people do start trying to customize how they render links, how they render images, and they find that it doesn't do something as they expect, then please contact us and we can probably pull those things apart a bit more so that you have more flexibility in which methods are available to you at different times. And yeah, messing with the different pipelines. How many people have customized any of the pipelines? No? Okay. But again, when I say messing with the pipelines, this means you can change how Glass constructs objects, how it resolves configuration at runtime, what happens when it saves data. If you wanted to, you could put your own custom saving method that actually saves something to a CRM in there as well. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. So, any questions? Actually, I put this on for a joke yesterday, and then some bad people took me out last night. So I'm now thinking that this is not a good question for me right now. feeling pretty worse aware. But does anyone have any questions? Yes.
What is the best way of making the Glass context injectable? So put in it as a dependency in the DI library.
Did everyone hear that? So what's the best way of making the Glass context injectable?
Can you show us an example?
Well, actually, yeah, with my current client, we do have a solution for that. But so what we did, and this is gets a bit more complicated, because obviously we need the site call service or the site call context available to us in our controllers. So we have a custom controller factory that looks through the different features we've got and decides which feature owns that controller. And then we use the IOC container for that feature. So we've got context per feature, but we've also got an IOC container per feature. And then the controller factory determines which IOC container to use and therefore which context to use. So it's not going to be easy to do that if you have a single IOC container. You may want to look at having multiple IOC containers. Or you have to have named components inside an IOC container. And then you could use different factory methods to get those named components out of your IOC container. But if you want to automatically just say, I want to add context and site call context, and it should just magically know which Glass context to use, that's not going to be easy unless you are using the site configuration. So if you're doing this, then you can get away with it. But remember, that's only on the site context. So any background services, that's not going to work.
If it's a feature level, it won't work because it will be at site level.
Yes, yes. So you have to, if you're using context per site, then yeah, you could probably get away with it. But otherwise, separate IOC container or some sort of factory. It's going to have to be the solution. Any more?
I'll ask questions.
Oh, no.
You know how you try to promote using view models over data models?
Yes.
Do you prefer doing fluent configuration?
For me, it's very much what do I need to achieve at that point in time. Do people understand the difference between data models and view models? There's kind of generally two ways most people write their Glass models. I say with the majority of the world uses data models, partly because of code generation tools. It's very easy then just to let the code gen do it and you don't have to think about it. I'm much more of the view model world. I like to handcraft the models I'm creating. The reason for that is then I can add on properties that I need for that view. Rather than being constrained to what the template is giving me, I can actually be a lot more expressive and reduce the amount of other code I have to write because I can maybe get the model to execute a query or pull back a different set of children than the normal template would have pulled back, that sort of thing. So then it's how do you configure that? Do you configure the view models with attributes or with fluent configuration? I'm still a bit old school because the fluent configuration stuff came a bit later and I still use attributes for the majority of the time. Just because it's like my go-to thing, like my muscle memory almost. It's a bit like when Site Call Rocks came out. I'm still a guy who goes into the Site Call content editor because I've been doing it since 5.2. That's just what I know. And every time I look at rocks, I go, ooh, this is really nice. I should probably make more use of this. But then I forget about it and I go back to doing what I do by default.
Do you have any examples of the class HTML customizations you could do?
I don't have any on me, but yeah, we can put some. You're trying to make me do some documentation. Evil, evil man. Any more questions? Cool.
You just have to have some questions. No?
No?
Ask him while he's here, otherwise he's not going to document.
Yeah.
So where is documentation?
Well, luckily we got an award yesterday for the fact that the community had done so much blogging. So I suppose I should say thanks to everyone in the community for writing my documentation for me to a certain extent. Yes. Keep asking us questions and keep pestering us on documentation, and then we will hopefully get around to it. Unfortunately, I can't commit to anything more than that, but because I'm a developer, it's like shiny new code or documenting. Shiny new code is always going to win. Yeah. Well, thank you for attending. I'll let you guys get to the coffee before everyone else does.
Thank you.